But let's talk a little about epiphenomenalism, which is more or less what I had in mind when I was describing the view that's implied by the behavioral sciences. I mean, I think most behavioral scientists would say, sure, what's going on in the body influences consciousness. Those nerve endings that sensed the pain are what led to the feeling of pain. It's just that feelings don't in turn feed back into the physical system. So if you're conceiving of consciousness in a kind of dualistic sense as something that's kind of a little, in some sense, different from the physical stuff, then you are, acknowledging one-way influence from body to consciousness. And that view, right, correct me if I'm wrong, but that view is known as epiphenomenalism. So subjective experience is an epiphenomenon of the physical being. It is influenced by that being, but it doesn't in turn influence the physical body. So consciousness is kind of like the relationship of my shadow, a shadow to my hand. If my hand is casting a shadow, right? The movement of my hand influences the shadow. Doesn't work the other way around.
Yeah, or the train and the steam engine and the steam whistle are another classic example. The workings of the engine causes the whistle. Every time the train is going, you get the whistle, but the whistle isn't actually doing anything. Mm-hmm. So yeah, and in philosophy, I mean, epiphenomenalism is a version, of the view known as dualism, where the physical and the mental are distinct domains, as opposed to materialism, where you say, well, the mental, consciousness is ultimately something physical. But the moment you've got dualism on the table, where there's the physical and the mental, there's the question, what does the mental actually do? Epiphenomenalism says the physical exerts a causal effect on the mental, right, but not vice versa. The other view, interactionism, says the physical exerts a causal effect on the mental, and the mental feeds back and affects the physical. But the epiphenomenalism says it's just one way.
Okay. Now I'm about to ask you a question that we shouldn't get sidetracked on for very long because it's not essential to the path we're taking. But you mentioned this idea that consciousness just is the physical. Now, to my way of thinking, that's tantamount to saying consciousness doesn't exist, but it may be more subtle than that. I know that when I accuse Dan Dennett of believing that consciousness doesn't exist, he gets really upset because he says he's saying something other than that, but what he's saying, if it's other than that, is not intelligible to me, okay? So when you say there's the view that consciousness is the physical, in your mind, is that different from just saying, look, consciousness is kind of an illusion, the way kind of Gilbert Ryle, Dan Dennett's mentor, said in a kind of more explicitly?
Yeah, I think there's room. I mean, there's a big tangle of different philosophical views here, and there are certainly some people, and Dan Dennett is one, who once you look at their view in detail, it does seem to be denying or rejecting some aspects of the traditional conception of consciousness. But that said, there are a lot of people, both philosophers and scientists out there, who both want to say consciousness exists and it's perfectly real, and they want to say it's physical. It's a process in the brain. That's probably the most popular combination of views. That's like, call it having your cake and eating it too. You get to say consciousness exists because it seems undeniable from the first person point of view that it does. It just seems so real. Anyone who, like Dan, flirts with denying it is generally regarded as saying something extremely counterintuitive and maybe inconsistent with just the data we have from our own experience. So it's very attractive to say consciousness exists. It's also very attractive to say it's just a process in the brain. So any number of people have tried to do both those things. The trouble is, it's just very hard to make that view work. Because to actually acknowledge the reality of consciousness, how on earth could you explain it wholly in terms of processes in the brain? It looks like all you get from processes in the brain are various behavioral effects and so on, which is great for explaining language or learning, not so great for explaining consciousness. But that said, I think at least as a philosophical view, we ought to acknowledge the possibility of someone saying consciousness is physical and it exists. The question is just, can they make it work? Okay. I don't think so.
Okay, so you and I are both closer to well, I'm agnostic, but I certainly find appealing a view that I think you find kind of naturally appealing, which is more or less epiphenomenal. Like consciousness deserves to be called something. It's something, but there's no reason to think it's influencing the body, in which case you're left with epiphenomenalism, because clearly bodily experiences are influencing consciousness. Now, that leads to my wacky theory, which is that, ironically, there's a sense in which an epiphenomenal consciousness could have a function.
Why don't
now,
we say just for a moment on epiphenomenalism,
Okay.
just before getting to the theories and so on? Because I think epiphenomenalism is worth some attention to think about both its upsides and its downsides.
Right.
I mean, the upside of epiphenomenalism, it gets to say consciousness is real, and it doesn't seem to, interfere with physical science and
Right.
neuroscience and cognitive science, which is doing a great job in their own right of explaining behavior. So think of it as a scientifically respectable form of dualism. The downside is it just seems bizarre that consciousness does nothing at all. Here, it seems like such an important thing. It seems kind of bizarre that it played no role in behavior. Surely my pain, for example, makes some difference in my withdrawing my hand from the flame. Or maybe here we are talking about consciousness. Surely my consciousness is playing some causal role in that. So many people find the idea that consciousness plays no causal role completely. People often use the word repugnant and counterintuitive. Now, I've tried, in some days I feel sympathetic with epiphenomenalism. I should say I don't have a fixed view about any of this. I mean, one view I'm kind of attracted to is, well, I think that consciousness needs to play a causal role in order to, vindicate its existence in the world. Maybe I think, for example, consciousness is the most important phenomenon in the universe in its own right. It's what gives everything in our lives meaning and value. So the epiphenomenalist can say, well, consciousness doesn't need to justify its existence by doing something else. Consciousness is itself the most important thing in existence. Everything else has to justify itself by its effects on consciousness. So that's a way of somehow reconciling it.
At the same time, there's nothing else that we know of in the universe that plays no role in the causal chain of physical events, right?
Yeah.
And B, as you said, it's what gives life meaning. I mean, if you imagine a planet full of beings that had no sentience, you wouldn't really care what happened to them because there would be no suffering or joy in any event, so there would be no real stake. So if in fact the thing that gives life meaning was not essential, it's like an add-on, well, that I think not implausibly leads to speculation about higher purpose or something. It's like, well, what gave us this gift? I mean, I think you'd be not crazy to ask that question.
Yeah, but the evolutionary question would be a really important one. How did this thing ever come into existence? How did it get selected for?
Sure.
I think the epiphenomenalist needs to say somehow consciousness was fundamental to the universe